You are listening to My Rejection Story, hosted by Alice Draper. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of My Rejection Story. Today, I'm chatting to Kenny Ethan Jones, who is a British activist, model, and author who made history as the first trans man to front a period campaign. His memoir, Dear Cisgender People, explores the intersection of being Black and trans. Kenny, welcome to My Rejection Story.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited. Let's get to it.
Me too. I'm so excited for today's conversation. I am going to lead our conversation with some of the research that I found as I was preparing for this episode. So I read that 39% of LGBTQ plus young people seriously considered suicide in 2023. I think that was through the Trevor Project. But that number jumped to 46% among non-binary and trans youth specifically. Interestingly, and this is where I kind of want to start the conversation off with, I think it was the 2022 US Trans Survey, which was the largest of its kind with over 92,000 respondents, found that family support is life-saving, and 69% of respondents with supportive families reported good health outcomes, and people who were not in gender-affirming homes experienced the opposite. I know, Kenny, from my research that your mum has been very supportive of your journey. Your dad, maybe a little bit more complicated.
Yeah.
On a personal level, would you agree with the finding that family support is life-saving?
1,000%. 1,000%. Like, it's such a necessary component when you are trying to navigate the world as a young person, experiencing like normal childhood things. And then you've got this massive question about your gender. And so you need somebody in your corner that is just there to say, hey, I'm that safe space when the world is not so kind to you and, I'm home. And you can have those conversations with those people. I think it's the most important aspect. I think data reflects the truth that if they don't come from supporting homes, then, they have much harder mental health essentially. And so, I think it's really important. And I think I encourage, throughout my work, people that are even parents of trans kids or, teachers, whatever, I always encourage them to essentially like listen and support in the best way possible. And that doesn't need to be, I think a lot of the question comes about, are they too young to know and understand, right? That's like a large part of this conversation sometimes. And it's like that doesn't, that shouldn't stop you from just showing up and listening and being supportive of what they're telling you is true. Like they're not lying to you. They're simply expressing how they feel and they want to be supported in that journey. And that was very much reflected in, me and my mum's relationship where I turn around and we didn't have nowhere near the language we had today, right? So it was just mumbled out. And my mum turned around and I tried to express how I felt at the time. And she said, "Oh, so you're a lesbian?" I was like, we're getting there, but not quite there, mum. And I said that I don't see myself as being a girl with a girl. I see myself as being a boy with a girl. And, my mum took a moment to process that and just looked at me and said, I think we should talk to a doctor. Because she understood that that wasn't her realm of expertise and she really wanted to help me understand what was going on as well as her. As much as I transitioned, we very much went on that journey together. She was attached to me by the hip and was with me along my entire journey. And I'm forever grateful for that. I think if I didn't have that support at such a young age, um, life would have been very difficult for me because life was harsh outside of her love and outside of the home. And so having that safe space to come back to was a really, like, it was an anchor and it was grounding. It was a safe space. And I think that every young person deserves that.
I agree. I saw someone talking about how they think that one of the unspoken privileges is like family privilege. And I completely agree. I think that having a supportive home can give anyone a lot more resilience to the world than people who have to fight a battle from when you're at your most vulnerable, which is 2, 3, baby, young. Trauma is like a very niche interest of mine. So, Kenny, as you're just touching on now, your mom being sort of when you shared that information, saying, I think we should talk to a doctor because this is outside my realm of expertise, which is so different to the story of so many trans people who share, when they first spoke to their parents and what their reaction was. Could you tell us a little bit more about your story? How old you were when you knew, or when you suspected? Yeah, kind of a little bit about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, of course. So one of my fondest memories was being at home. My mum used to look after, we lived in a tall block, tower block, and she used to look after a lot of the boys. And it was like a parent situation where, we all kind of like chipped in to help. We all looked up, my mum, they all looked after each other's kids essentially to like help with childcare. And yeah, just multiple boys and me basically. And I remember my mum had an open door policy when it came to the bathroom. And I remember, running past, I was about 3 or 4 at the time. And I remember consistently running past and seeing how all the boys would pee, right? And so when it came to my time to use the toilet, I tried to use the toilet in the same way and it didn't work out. So I climbed on the toilet bowl, planted both my feet on either side, and I basically peed everywhere, unfortunately, and then fell into the toilet bowl, hysterically cried. And then my mum's come in and said, why have you done that? And I said, I'm just trying to pee, you know? And I think that was my mum's first moment where she went, okay, why has my child tried to do that? And I think maybe at that age, she might have just thought, oh, I was just copying other kids, but specifically, I was copying the boys. And I think as I got older, that became more and more true, I remember in primary school, used the boys' toilets and nobody kind of like questioning that and just being left to my own devices because when you're younger, no one really limits that expression. So you just kind of get on with life. And so I've spent a lot of my younger years essentially, wearing boys' clothes, doing more like playing football, doing those quote unquote more typical things that boys tend to do. And it was only as I went to secondary school where I really started to understand the friction. There were small things in my childhood that made me realize that like the way that people perceived me and the way that I perceived myself was different. So, for instance, I would be outside the school gates with my mum and they would be questioning my mum about why I don't dress girlier. I think that's a weird question, Why is she asking that? But I couldn't make sense of it. But when I went to secondary school, I went to an all-girls school. And that was the moment where I said, I am not supposed to be here. This is not my environment. This is not how I see myself. And it honestly, it felt like being trapped in this, like the way my own world and then the world around me, it felt so discombobulated. I couldn't understand what was happening. And I remember every day taking the bus to school, really just thinking about life and thinking about why am I in an all girls school? Does everybody else see me as a girl? I'm not a girl. I don't understand how I got here, especially when I had been raised in such a way that was practically like more like genderless and I could do what I wanted. And now I'm being told, no, you have to wear a skirt and a blazer. You're going to attend a school with only girls. You're going to study religion. None of the things that I was interested in really doing. And so I really struggled with it. And within 6 months, I had that conversation with my mum that I mentioned earlier because I just really I couldn't live that way. I really couldn't. And so, yeah, one of the days I remember going to school and just really starting to hate my life, if I'm honest, and saying I can't live my life this way, and I have to make a change, and I have to tell the person that I trust the most about how I feel, which was my mum. And so I made a promise to myself and a commitment that I think it was like in a week's time, if I still felt this way after school, I was going to tell her because I didn't know how long I could possibly live like that. And so, yeah, I just came home one day and it just all kind of fell out. And I don't know how much sense it probably made to my mum in the beginning. It was just like, Mom, why did you send me to this school? Because we had conversations about that. And my mum, people ask me in this story, why did your mum send you to that school? I'm like, I don't think she really knew what was happening then. And it was a good school. It had, the best kind of results in terms of education and the girls leaving the school. So it was done with my best interest at heart, but it just really wasn't who I was. And so, yeah, I came home and told my mum everything.
Yeah. And did you have the language? This is something I've like is very interesting to me is yeah, I don't know actually know how old you are, so I don't know if you
I'm
had
31
yes.
now. So I was 11 when I came out. So you're talking about what? 20 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. So very different to today, right? And I think that kids in some ways are lucky it's at being the information era where there is a lot more language available through the internet to describe identity, experiences. And when we can put language to something, I think it's a lot easier to make sense of and quite healing in a way. But I'm curious, like with you being 11, 20 years ago, probably not having that language, what that was like trying to make sense verbally of what's going on, who you are.
Yeah, I think it was, I I think both, it came in its pros and cons, essentially, because not having the language caused me to, I guess, try to explain and describe how I was feeling in different ways, which meant that me and my mum was having more conversations because I couldn't put my finger on it, the exact wording. It was just me describing how I felt in certain scenarios. And I think that actually over time, that probably gave my mum more confidence in my gender identity and that I was trans because we've had so many deep conversations at this point about like how I feel. And it just, yeah, it led to a more, I guess, fruitful conversation between her and I. And I think that that was an important part of our journey of her, being in my corner is because she's had those conversations and she has so much faith in what I'm saying and belief that she wants to be in my corner and, be my greatest advocate in this journey. Which maybe I'm not saying she wouldn't have because my mum's a legend, but maybe she wouldn't have had the same level of confidence to support my journey had we not had those like in-depth conversations. So yeah, I think it was really important. But I think the struggle that you have, it's a little going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but I think when I was younger, in terms of explaining to other people that I was trans, it was a lot more accepted because it was just, oh, so Kenny's a boy. Okay, cool. That was it. There wasn't these massive conversations or debates about my rights or what bathrooms I should use. It was very much, oh, Kenny's just Kenny. And I think that with the rising of trans rights and us trying to, just basically have human rights, there's become a lot more negative conversation about us and misinformation spread, which I didn't have to deal with when I was transitioning. So my transition, so to speak, was, I guess, somewhat more fairly peaceful in terms of the public conversation surrounding my identity. Whereas now it's extremely difficult for young people to come up in today's world and be trans because there's just, you turn on any media channel and someone's talking negatively about the trans community. And, it's heartbreaking when you're that age and you're just trying to navigate being a normal teenager and understanding yourself. And you've got this massive, it's like cloud of media saying that trans people are horrible in the background. And that's what you're living in. Yeah, it's pros and cons.
Yeah, I mean, this is so interesting. Am I understanding you correctly in saying that with less awareness, there was actually less pressure
Yeah.
in when you made the decision to transition?
No, not necessarily pressure. I just mean that there was less scrutiny around
Mm.
being trans. There was less questions. When I came out as trans, there wasn't really any visible representation anywhere. So there was never this commentary of, oh, because I've seen it, that's what I've seen, and then I believe I'm trans. Like, no, I've been following my heart this entire time. So there was less ways to cast doubt about my gender identity and saying that I'm a boy. Versus now, I think it's more difficult because loads of people try to dismiss it by saying, with visibility, more people are becoming trans. It's like, no, you've just given people the understanding and the framework to identify who they are by somebody else's journey. So I just think it's a different time. That's all.
If you could go back in time, would you want there to have been more visible representation when you made that decision, or would you have preferred the current circumstance? I mean, sorry, not the circumstances that you were in at the time.
I think I would have appreciated a level of visibility because so much of my life felt like I was guessing my own blueprint. I didn't really have this. When you're a cis girl or a cis boy, you kind of know what your life is going to look like, right? And I just didn't have that. But in the same way, that was kind of beautiful because I was left to then build my own sense of self and identity, but it just meant it was a lot more work, and I had to ask myself a lot more questions. And I had to build my identity around things that were different to cis boys, especially around the fact that, I experienced periods. And so I have this really loving relationship and understanding relationship with women that experience periods, which I don't share with men, but I'm also a man and I live more in this realm. And so it was like, I guess, navigating how I felt about my identity and building something that really worked for me. But ultimately, I'm really grateful for that now at this age because I think it's just made me so much more aware and stronger in who I am because I'm like, I literally built this. You know, I had no blueprint to follow. Everything that I am has come from me making decisions about what kind of person I want to show up in this world and what I want to support and, you know, all of those kind of like bigger questions that you ask yourself about your identity.
It's such big questions for anyone, and so without having a blueprint, I can only imagine how much resilience and self-awareness that took. And I'm glad you had that support structure in your mom. Shifting gears a little bit, do you remember the first memory you have of being rejected for your gender identity?
Do you know what? When you asked me to come on this podcast, that was this story I'm going to tell was the first one that came to mind. It was hard at the time. I'll be honest. Nobody likes rejection. Let's be real. And I had a massive crush on a girl, massive crush, beautiful. I still have a lot of love and respect for her to this day. But yeah, you know, I was smitten for her. And I think that was very obvious. And you know, I tried to be sweet and try to flirt here and there where I could. And she reciprocated a little bit. You know, there was an energy there. But when it came to, I guess, discussing my identity, that's where there was a little bit of friction. And she, you know, lovingly kind of rejected me on the basis, well, not on the basis of my identity, but more about genitalia preference. She just said that, like, she doesn't know, like, from a sexual perspective, would she find my body necessarily attractive? And that was really hard to hear. And she did it in such a respectful manner. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't disrespectful. It's just literally like, this is just what I like. And I'm not sure that I'm going to like the opposite. And it was a real mature conversation for that age because I must have been around 15, 16 years old.
Wow.
So it was like bless her, she did her absolute best at, you know, framing that conversation in a way that had love and care in it and dignity and respect. And yeah, I just kind of sat there for a minute. And obviously, your first reaction when you're hurt is like defense, defense, defense. And I kind of just smiled at her because I didn't know what else to do because I felt so much gratitude for the way that she had held care around the conversation we was having. But obviously, I was upset because I really liked this girl, right? And I just turned around and said, you know what, I understand, you know, I get it. And that's okay. You know, just sometimes it doesn't work out between people. And I'm grateful that I've even been able to feel these feelings and have the excitement of seeing you. And maybe we leave it here. And that's kind of okay. And so I guess, you know, it is a quote unquote rejection story, but I didn't necessarily feel rejected. I just felt like we had come to our natural end and it was okay that we wasn't completely compatible. And, you know, I went on to have an incredible dating life afterwards. So it's all good.
That's amazing. When I think back to like the 15-year-olds that I was around when I was 15, I think that there could have been some much harsher rejections just on the level of like awareness. I mean, that anyone had.
Yeah. I mean, looking back, I just think, wow, the level of intelligence from that girl at that time and just being able to express herself to that degree and also just acknowledge what she likes and doesn't necessarily like, I think was really powerful. And really beautiful. A really lovely conversation that I carry a lot. And, you know, I still see her on social media from time to time and I still smile when I see her, you know, because it reminds me of a very important lesson as well that sometimes as a trans person, it's very easy to take everything as a punch about your identity. And sometimes people don't necessarily mean it that way. It's just, you're just not compatible as people. And that's okay because you are compatible with somebody else. And somebody else is going
Yeah.
to find you highly beautiful. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, it was a beautiful,
Yeah.
powerful conversation.
You know, I talk to people about rejection a lot, obviously, on this podcast, and I think those early rejections can be quite defining. So, when an early rejection is met with in just a very mean way and really rude, and that can be in families, it can be in dating, it can be school, bullying, it can make it much harder to kind of go out there again. And so, I'm interested that you just said now that you have like gone on to have a great dating life. And again, my research kind of stats show that a lot of trans people struggle with dating. So I think there was one study that was across about almost 1,000 participants where 87.5% said that they would not consider dating a trans person. And I can imagine that for people entering dating apps or however they're entering their dating life, it can feel very scary knowing that there is so much transphobia out there and that you're not always going to be met kindly. So I'm curious what, I guess, right now, what is it like dating as a trans man? I don't know if you are in a relationship or not. But I'm curious.
I'm very single and not dating at the moment, but we can talk about when I was previously dating and how I found it then. I think it's about it's really hard and there's no perfect answer. And I think that my situation is going to be very different to other people's because the conversation about me being trans comes up a lot earlier because it's involving of my work. Whereas for some people, obviously, that conversation can be delayed. But I think it's about kind of asking those. I used to ask a lot of questions about the queer community because I was trying to understand what their relationship was like with queerness to begin with. And in the beginning, I found it a lot easier and more comfortable to date women that was bisexual, just because they like everybody. So I felt like it was going to be a higher possibility that there was going to be less rejection there. And then naturally, as I gained more confidence and got older, I was just like, I'm just gonna go and find people that I like and hope that it works out. Um, there always, even to this day, there's always that moment when my heart drops a little bit when I go to tell them that, hey, this is who I am. And, that fear of maybe being met with rejection. But I think I've done a lot of groundwork prior to that to understand that I don't think with most of the people that I've chosen to date that that's ever going to be an issue. Because I've kind of like scoped out, what kind of like politics do they have? They surrounded by queer people in their life? What do they feel about queer people? What was their, did they have any times in their life previously where they, did some exploring around their sexuality? So I think having those conversations really helps to inform me how they're most likely to react when I tell them. And if I got to a point in that kind of research period where I felt like it wasn't necessarily going to work out, I heard something that felt like, "Oh, no, maybe not the person for me," then I'd probably just leave and wouldn't disclose that I'm trans anyways. So
Yeah.
I think a good strategy is probably my advice there, and trust in your instincts. Really trust in your instincts. Like, I think that's a massive part of it as well. You don't want to, there's been times where I have dated people and, unfortunately felt a bit like an experiment. They were just more interested in my identity than who I was as a person. I don't fuck with that. So yeah, it's just, you gotta trust your instincts that, that person is there for you, that they don't, they're not gonna essentially feel a way about your transness and then they're gonna support you. Listen, the person you date and end up with and potentially marry if that's what you want to do is the most important person of your life. They are gonna determine who you become in the future massively. And so you want to be with somebody that ultimately loves you as much as, probably, hopefully more than you love you. And so, yeah, I just think that don't settle for less at all when it comes to who you're dating and how they feel about you and, those shared values that are really important to you.
Yeah, I completely I love what you just said, and I'm really interested in you talking about that like research process or vetting people before you even disclose that you're trans, because as you said, they're the most important person. And another thing I want to just mention is that I think self confidence and self trust is such an important piece to not just settling for someone who either use you as like a fetish or something or is just going to treat you unkindly. So I'd love to hear a little bit, if I don't know if you can share details on kind of like what that vetting process could look like if someone listening is maybe in a similar situation and they want to steal your framework, if you're open to sharing it.
Yeah.
Or yeah, even trusting your instincts, what that looks like.
Yeah. I mean, so, I ask all those, let's say we're on a dating app. The first thing I'm probably looking for in a dating app is I'm looking at the pictures with their friends. So I'm looking at who they hang around with, the location of the bar, are they in a queer bar, things like that. I'm just trying to scope, is there a trans flag? Have you named your politics on your dating profile? I'm checking all of those things, those introductional things. And then, as we're having this natural conversation about, just life and getting to know each other, um, I also, like, what's your favorite bar? Things like that. Just understanding those things also tries to, like, it helps shape your understanding of who this person is. sometimes I'll intentionally share a news article, for instance, and say, "Hey, I saw this. What do you think about this?" And because that tends to get right to the root of their thinking and how they see the world, and that's really super super helpful. So, any article about something to do with, I don't know, right now a massive conversation about like puberty blockers, for instance, I can say, "Hey, I came across this. What do you think about it?" You know, and just kind of like take it from there. And again, just like listening to the information that you're hearing, potentially sometimes if I'm kind of unsure, I'll say like meet me, but I'll be with like a gay friend, for instance, and I'll see how they react around being around this person. And so it's just doing these small things to kind of slowly understand where they stand on certain things, right? And so yeah, it's just a lot of that really. I can't individually think of anything else that I've
No,
specifically
but
done.
this is fantastic. Like, just the idea of, like, sharing, getting this conversation, actually believing what you see, which I think a lot of people struggle with in dating, is like we can like convince ourselves that they're not who they're showing they are. So when someone says something that's like pretty offensive, regardless of the topic, like take that as a data point and don't just discard it because they look cute or there was something about them that you liked.
Yeah, listen to the
And I
red
love
flag.
yeah, believing the red flags when they showcase themselves. And I like, the idea of sharing news articles. So I'm going to shift the topic a little bit for the last segments of the show. When I
Mhm.
was researching this episode, I actually did like a little bit of SEO research, which is something that I like to do for episodes. And something that came up as kind of like on the top of SEO was transgender family rejection. And so I'm guessing that's something that a lot of people look up and sort of struggle with when they're kind of going through that gender transition or considering it and everything. So I know, kind of having listened to a bit of your story, that while we kind of explored how accepting your mom has been from the beginning, with your dad, it was a little bit more complicated.
Mm.
Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So my relationship with my dad was definitely complex and very layered. He's a Caribbean man born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica, in a place that isn't necessarily the nicest towards queer people. And so I was very respectful and understanding that that's where he was raised, and the beliefs that he had in his life had been shaped from where he was raised. So navigating a relationship with him and telling him that I was trans, I knew was going to be a struggle. And I knew that telling him possibly came with the risk of losing him and no longer having a relationship with him. That was a real risk that I was aware of. And it was probably why, I waited a bit longer to tell him and begged my mum not to tell him, because I was very fearful of losing that relationship. We didn't have a massive one before that, if I'm being very honest, but like, he's my dad. I still wanted him to be a part of my life. And so it was just a lot more of a delicate approach with him. Like when I came home to mum, it was just, this is how I feel. My dad was like, no, I'm gonna have to slowly, slowly will this one off to him. So yeah, I remember getting to the point where I knew I was gonna have to tell him. There was a period where I shortly lived with him because my mum was ill. And I think it was becoming more obvious to him that I wasn't just a quote unquote tomboy, you know. And he didn't want to ask me what was going on because I feel like he feared the answer. But he was aware that, the child that he raised might not be coming out of the way that he thought that this child was going to turn out, essentially. And I remember just kind of leaving like breadcrumbs for him over time and just basically sharing that like I didn't feel comfortable in my gender a little bit. And not like massively telling him. I knew how I felt. I was very like, to everybody else, I was very confident and I was straightforward. But with him, I needed more space. I needed more time. And I felt like that was the right approach. So yeah, I was explaining, oh, I don't necessarily feel comfortable with this, and I don't really like girls' clothes, and just giving him that information to kind of like, I guess, digest. And then one day I decided that today was the day, and that I was gonna have to tell him that this is how I truly felt. When I told him initially, it wasn't met with the kindness and graciousness that it was met with when I told my mum. It wasn't a horrible experience, but it felt like my dad was trying to shut down the conversation and kind of ignore it, which I understood, and I kind of anticipated was going to be what would happen. And so I just kind of left it there. And I think that for a while he tried to ignore it, and I just became I stood on business more about it basically over time. I was like, Dad, this is who I am. And like, if you don't accept me, you're not going to have a child, you know? And I would overhear him and my mum having conversations, and my mum would be trying to, slowly make him understand things a bit more. And he was a little bit ignorant towards what she was saying, and just, you know, and my mum made it clear as well, you're gonna lose your relationship with your child if you don't accept your child. And that was it. And yeah, as I got a bit older, that contention got worse over time because I was no longer accepting him calling me my previous name. He was like, you need to call me Kenny now. This is what this is going to be. Like, you are going to respect me in this situation, even if you don't agree. Very hard to do to your dad, by the way. It's a very, very hard situation
I think
to
it's
be in.
something that many people never do with their parents.
I don't blame them because it's incredibly difficult. But I think it was easy for me to also do that, knowing that I had my mum in my corner, and my mum was my predominant parent. So it was for me, it felt like it was a plus if my dad stays around. But I've got my mum anyways. So I went into this situation with that love and support, knowing that I'm gonna have that regardless of this outcome. So it made it easier to stand up to my dad essentially. And so one day my dad had a visitor around, and he was like, "Oh, like this is my child Kay." And I was like, "Okay, this is new." So my previous name also started with K. So it was a middle ground that we had now reached where he wasn't calling me his son, but he wasn't calling me his daughter, and he wasn't calling me Kelsey, but he wasn't calling me Kenny. And I was like, "Well, this is progress. I like this." And I didn't want to make a big deal about it at the time, but like when I left, I cried because I felt that this was a really big step for us. You're introducing me now to people as K. And yeah, I came home so excited and told my mom. I was like, "Mom, Dad called me K." And she's like, "Yes." I was like, "Yes." And it just it we started to have a few up and downs. So after I did that, I shaved my head and then changed my name legally, and I didn't tell him I was gonna do this. And this whenever my dad, and I think most people with Caribbean parents will understand this, when they get really angry and they start talking their language, you know that they're really pissed off with you. And so he was mad at me and started speaking at me in Patois and cussing me. And I said, "Whatever, Dad, this is my choice. I stand by it. This is the right decision for me. Like, I'm really sorry if you don't understand it or you don't like it, but I need to be who I am. And that's kind of the way that this is gonna be forever. Yeah, it just got to a point over time where we just started to find more middle ground, and he became more accepted. And then one day he introduced me to a friend's son, and I was like, "Oh, like I'm his son." But, that's cool. That's really nice. And so it was just lots of those baby steps that we took together. And, unfortunately, he really came around just before he passed away. He was really ill with, cancer that got diagnosed really late, and so we didn't have much time with each other, unfortunately. But we had reached a really good point in our relationship. And I remember going to the hospice that he was at the time, I was obsessed with motorbikes, got my first motorbike, and he also loved motorbikes. And so we had this real, like, father and son moment discussing our love for cars and bikes, and, him kind of teaching me life lessons about women. And it just felt like that was the version of him I really wanted all along. I really just wanted a dad that was going to be a dad and respect me as his son. And unfortunately, I didn't get to have many moments like that with him. But, to have that most beautiful moment just before his passing was one of the greatest gifts that I think I've ever received, because I got that, and that's the last memory that I have with him. So yeah, I'm really grateful that I got that with him.
Thank you for sharing, Ken. I'm sorry that you didn't get more time with him, and I'm so glad that you. I mean, I'm sorry to bring you to tears here. I was also getting really emotional because I know that this is something that so many. I mean, every single human being on this earth wants to be seen and accepted by their parents, and so many people don't get that. And so I think people listening will be emotional too, I'm sure, because I mean, you can sort of almost we were feeling this journey and just so glad that he came around.
I'm very
For
lucky.
any listeners and specifically trans listeners whose parents are not a safe place, is there anything you would want to share based on your experience or your thoughts?
Are we talking to the parents or the young people?
The young people
Yeah.
listening who are struggling with this and they feel like their parents are not coming around.
Yeah. Yeah. I think first of all, I just want to acknowledge how difficult that must be. Thankfully, I only had one difficult relationship, and like I said earlier, having the power of my mum's helped me navigate my dad's relationship. So yeah, it's incredibly difficult to be in that position, and I think that I would recommend feeling that and accepting that as a large part of the process because you just got to in a therapeutic way, you've got to let that sit. You've got to let that sit and exist within you. And what you can do, and what I highly recommend, is a part of a lot of queer people's journey is building your own family outside of your biological family. And so, choosing those people around you that are really supportive and finding those safe spaces is extremely important. If you don't find them in your parents or siblings or cousins or whatever it may be, so yeah, finding that kind of like support network when the world is really harsh, that you have this safe space to go back to is important. And then if you have the capacity, trying to engage in a dialogue with your parents of just understanding, trying to understand what it is that they're rejecting and what they don't like and what they're not agreeing with. You might end up having some really insightful conversations, which may actually over time, like much like my dad, turn around and blossom and you find mutual ground and, that relationship might not look perfect, but you might have a better relationship than you do currently. But I also think on the other side of that, on the flip side, it's massively important for your mental health and your well-being to know when to leave, when it's not safe for you. And when you are giving too much to a relationship that is not working for you and is only being detrimental to your health. I think you also need to respect and understand that unfortunately that's the case and you need to leave. And again, need to find those places, those people that become your safe spaces instead of those people. And I just think, yeah, you have to take it by relationship to relationship. But like one of the things that I always like to recommend, and I've suggested this a few times, and I've put to followers, and funny enough, and they come back to me with stories, positive stories about how they've managed to create better relationships with their parents. So for instance, I had a follower that messaged me and this person was questioning their gender, and they said that my dad doesn't really understand it. He's what you'd classify as like a real traditional kind of lad, and he's not being massively disrespectful, but he doesn't respect what I'm telling him, and he doesn't necessarily like fully believe it. And I said, okay, have you tried sending him articles of things and having him read things and getting him to like understand a bit more about your world and what you're experiencing? And this person said, oh, he's not really engaging with it. He's not a massive reader. I said, okay, cool. So what is he into? It turns out he's into like F1, like the car racing stuff. And so I said, there's some like queer F1 events that maybe you and your dad can go to. So take him to his environment or things that he likes, but in your kind of space, right? So that he's around people where he can see queer people and kind of like understand more in that way. So this person said, hey, I think this is a great idea. I'm going to do that. So anyways, takes their dad to this event. And the dad loves F1, dad's having a fantastic time, and then ends up having a few fruitful conversations with people that are there that are of their queer people, right? And yeah, they come home and the dad's basically turned around and said, like, I had a really nice time, and those people are actually really nice. And this person just messaged me and said, thank you so much. I just feel like this has been a really big step because my dad doesn't even spend time around queer people. And so the fact that he's gone somewhere and he said he's had a nice time is is a massive deal. And I said, oh, I'm so happy to hear that it worked. Just keep that conversation going and just try to find these middle grounds in both of your lives and both of your interests. And hopefully that will help to develop a relationship where, he understands you a bit more. And, he also, you're giving him into his world, you're both paying an interest into both people's interests. And I think that's one of the best pieces of advice that I can give to people who are trying to cultivate a relationship with somebody who may not be the most accepting at the moment.
Thank you. This was beautiful and I think so helpful for so many listeners. Knowing when to leave being a big one. I think, just your advice about the F1 was just really great. And just something that came to mind is like, I think for parents, representation can be seriously, there is none. So when they think of someone trans, they probably maybe met, I'm just giving an example from one of my
Mm,
parents, as I remember, like that they'd met one person and this was the person that they'd kind of characterized all trans people as being
mm,
like. And so that example you give of F1 is like allowing your parent who probably has not met a lot of queer people or trans people to see some, just have some better representation and kind of open their mind a little bit. But Kenny, thank you so much for your time. This conversation has been amazing. And thank you for going in all these different directions with me. For listeners who really want to learn more about you and connect with you and your work, where should they go and where should they start?
yeah. So my predominant platform is Instagram at Kennington Jones. I'm currently on TikTok under the same username, and I'm, sharing this beautiful story of how I harvested my eggs for my sister, in order for her to be able to have a baby. So that's a really exciting journey that we're on right now. I also, like you mentioned earlier, published a book in 2024 called Dear Cisgender People. That's an incredible tool, for somebody that, needs an introductional level into the world of transness. Essentially, it's very, everything to explain is very like A, B, C, D, and then we work our way up. So don't feel overwhelmed or like you need this background knowledge to read it. I think it's an incredible resource. It's a perfect blend, I like to say, of political and personal. So I use my personal story to, guide the political conversation that's happening about trans people. And I also own a masculine styled period underwear company called Lost Fame. We have 3 incredible styles. There will be something for you, I promise. And so, yeah, if you want to support me, it'd be incredible if you check that out, share that, potentially buy a pair for yourself or, somebody that you love. But yeah, those are the places to find me. And yeah, hopefully you do. And if you listen to this episode, send me a message and let me know how you found it. It's always good to hear feedback and the people's stories and yeah, just I like engaging with people. So please do. Thank you.
When so everything will be in the show notes, including Kenny's Instagram, so you can pop him that message. But also his book, which I highly recommend reading. Thank you so much for the time, Kenny.
Thank you.
Stop. This was My Rejection Story, hosted by me, Alice Draper.